The sweet scent of honeysuckle and warm light shining on me, I awoke gently, stretching my legs, then arms, before opening my eyes to the pleasant sight of the garden encircling me. Taking hold of the nearby plants, I pushed myself over the garden, lazily drifting along the length of it. As I approached the heart of the garden, I came to a stop, grabbing hold of the vines that wrap around and raise up the petals of the control center. It reacted to my presence, blooming open in a flash of spiraling lights, rising above it and forming an image of the star blossom. On the outskirts of the petals, an image of the great bulk of Thuria. Though the image showed it much smaller than the star blossom, it was, in fact, massive, a helix of rotating cylinders connected to a vast tether to the surface of Mars. It, in reality at least, was so much larger than the star blossom, a fact being represented by the image of the colony growing in size rather than closing in distance. Runes of control formed in the sea of sparkles as my hands approached the petals. Without a glance, I configured my ship for an approach and landing, plotting a circular route so that I might see the colony in greater detail before landing. As soon as the path was laid, I pushed away from the controls, closing up again as I departed, pushing my way along the cylindrical garden of my home to the far end, where I could look beyond its confines to the worlds and stars of the system. The little dome settled on the exterior of the star blossom like a thorn on the stem of a rose. It stood out from the smooth green exterior of the ship. As I settled into the dome, I could see Mars beyond, but Thuria was much closer, already dominating the view. Despite the cylinders having rotation for gravity, their exterior skins did not. Smooth and shimmering in the light of the sun, they looked like great spires of snow rising from a stem, firmly rooted in the soil of Mars. The star blossom arced slowly around the body of Thuria, headed for one of the lowest cylinders of its body. Other ships scattered about were drifting or moving from one place to another, like bees in search of nectar. I could see many coming or going from the ends of these snow pillars. Finally, I could see the entrance through which I would travel, a great opening on the outside end of the cylinder. Even this was much larger than my ship, more than 5 kilometers in diameter. Even as I approached, I could see many other ships flowing in and out of it, nothing more than a plasma screen separating the interior and exterior. As I passed from the stars to this single cylinder of many, my view became dominated by the interior city of thousands of towers, still kilometers below me. The star blossom losing altitude gently towards the surface, I could see the landing area that was my target, a spire of many layered platforms, each covered with circular depressions of many sizes. The star blossom gently settled in the center of one. As my ship made its final descent, I swiftly pushed myself from my dome and almost swam to the exit, slipping seamlessly through the exit and into the world beyond, sliding easily from my ship's interior into the soft and feminine flesh of my body. In the same moment, I stepped from the star blossom. As I exited my ship, I looked back at it, the closing petals covering where my body slept during the journey. Now a beautiful but closed flower, standing just a meter taller than I, and dwarfed by the Martian shuttle in the next bay, much more similar in size to a small asteroid, and about as beautiful. I spent no time lingering in this glorified car park, turning and braking into a sprint towards the edge of the high platform, leaping from it and down towards the ground more than a kilometre below, the wind rushing through my hair and drawing my clothing into a comet's tail of flapping, shimmering fabric. After a short while, I turned my mind to my clothing, pushing it into the shape of wings, arcing out of my freefall and into a gentle glide over this densely urban cityscape. My destination ahead, the inner cap of the cylinder, still more than 200 kilometres from my ship. My glide carried me just 4. As I finally approached the ground, I aimed for a small grassy park area, pulling my clothes back and rolling across the grass. Once I was standing once more, I turned to follow the path in my mind, following a short route to a train station. The streets around me filled with a great diversity of people, Martians of many kinds and more besides. Beyond them, the many stores, cafes and bars. My stature made me stand out, more than a metre taller than most of those around me, my soft and bluish skin, a stark contrast from the reddened skin of the Martian races. My silken, flowing clothing of whites and silver was equally as different from their functional and drab clothing. My feet carried me swiftly to the station and aboard a train already there. Though the train's ceiling was high enough for me to stand, its seats were not so comfortable, so I chose to stand, the train pulling gently from the station only moments after I had boarded. Soon the train had ridden up the lev tracks to glide among the many tall spires of this cylindrical city. Accelerating up to great speeds, the train was soon rushing past the scene beyond. The train itself was silent, but the chatter of dozens of conversations filled the air within. Martians in small groups sitting together were engaged in many conversations. At one end of the train, a business meeting was even occurring. I moved to the rear end, where the noise was somewhat reduced. It was going to take over an hour for the train to reach the terminus of the tether, so I sat, legs crossed, on the floor at the far end of the vehicle, closing my eyes and turning my attention to the world within my mind. The garden of my ship surrounding me once more. I drifted among its blossoms and branches, passing the journey in the calm and beautiful surroundings of this garden of mine. The hour and a half seemed to swiftly pass, and soon enough I drifted back to the noisy interior of the train. We were approaching the terminus, and many occupants were preparing to depart. Rising from the floor, I made my way to the now busy doors, awaiting its opening and the next leg of my journey. The train gently drifted to a halt, the doors opening within moments of the train coming to a complete stop. Martians swarmed out immediately after. Once the throng had swept out, I slipped through the doors, moments before a swarm of fresh commuters boarded. The terminus was enormous. The static hub of this cylinder, it did not spin, but I could feel the air, thick with utility nanites, pushing down on me, maintaining the sensation of gravity on the station. Though I prefer to float, though the nanites gave me no choice in the matter. The area more than a kilometre across, and my destination at its heart, I chose to sprint again, rushing past the slow-walking Martians on their way to and from some social or work task. Hundreds of metres swept below my feet in moments, and I was soon at the entrance gates to the elevator, a cylinder standing 100 metres tall, cargo being fed into it above, and people boarding at the gates. My speed swept me through the gates and towards the seats at the outer edge, the ones that offered the best view. Some were suited more to my size, so I selected a seat and settled in for the journey to Helium. As I sat and waited, the elevator slowly filled with people. The bottom deck, where I had sat, filled within a few minutes, but people continued to enter, heading for one of the upper decks. I had to wait for almost an hour, time I spent watching the people through the windows. The central elevator was surrounded by terminals for trains to many destinations in the cylinders of Thuria. Hundreds of people were coming and going, some heading for Mars below, others for destinations on Thuria or beyond orbit entirely. Families, business types, police, children, and swarms of others, all smoothly forming rivers of people rolling around the terminus, shedding and gaining people continually. Eventually, the gates closed and the elevator decoupled from the colony. The gravity of Mars, though minuscule at this altitude, began to tug on the elevator, but it was the sudden push from Thuria that we felt most keenly, an upward force of G's, at least in part countered by the downforce of nanites in the air. Quickly, the elevator accelerated towards Mars below, falling towards it far beyond the speed of sound, though the counters around the elevator showed a timer of more than 8 hours. Many occupants settling in for some sleep or watching entertainment. Once we were underway, the lights on the number of vending machines illuminated, and people began to move around the room. As I watched the view out of the window, I found it wholly disappointing. The stars were all that I could see from here, Mars entirely hidden by the floor of the elevator. I soon closed my eyes and drifted back to my garden, taking the controls and spiralling time downward, pushing hours into minutes. Soon enough, I opened my eyes and the elevator had slowed significantly, the bulk of Mars's surface now coming into view out of the window, and the sky blue with the light of the sun. The sun even setting behind the distant horizon at great speed. Within minutes, the sun had disappeared behind the now green landscape of Mars, leaving the darkening night sky for several minutes more. Soon after, the elevator windows were swamped by clouds. Though the view was obscured for just seconds, the windows wetted by the descent. The sky went from blue to starry black to grey in the space of 10 minutes, reminding me how long it had been since I stood on the soil of a world. I eyed the clock on the window, still claiming our arrival was more than 20 minutes away. Rising from my seat, I walked to the interior area, where several vending machines stood in an arc around the central pillar and stairs. The variety of options were huge, thousands of Martian meals and snacks on offer, along with a few delicacies of other worlds. I selected a burrito from the menu at one, the vending machine taking my virtual currency and fabricating a fresh, hot chicken burrito in seconds. Having retrieved a snack, I returned to my seat, allowing me to enjoy the dark but beautiful view of Mars as I consumed the flavourful burrito, putting the leftover packaging in my pocket recycler. The elevator had slowed to a crawl now, entering the tip of Helium's cable spire. The last minutes of the timer ticked down as we approached the ground level of this grand structure, the view out of the window showing the interior space of the tower as we descended. Many glass-walled walkways snaking between balconies were themselves leading to other interiors. Even here the greenery of Mars could be seen, great Bodhi trees weaving themselves into the structure alongside vines, creepers and honeysuckle, one of my favourites. The elevator drifted to a stop at the base of the tower, the gates opening immediately, and the swarm of Martians began to disembark. Beyond the windows I could see the tops of trees encircling the elevator, though some 100 metres away, the gap between them filled with the throng of departing people. I sat and enjoyed the scene for a few minutes, waiting for the crowd to clear. Finally, the trees were visible to the ground, at which I rose again and made for the exit. The sticky, nanite-filled air of the elevator washed away by the sweet-smelling breeze that only nature can bring. The 4 feet of the tower were visible beyond this forest of birch and elm. Pathways cut through the forest in 8 directions, 4 to train stations and 4 to the feet of the tower. Most of the passengers were headed down these paths at a slow walk. Turning west, I broke into a sprint once more, the low gravity of Mars barely keeping me on the ground. I swept past the people among the trees, out into the surrounding city and the westbound train station, my destination. Soon I had arrived at the station and boarded a train headed for Zelanka City, almost 5,000 kilometers west of me. I went to a sleeper pod, settling in for the day-long journey across the world. Again, I drifted among the plants of my garden and spiraled time down, the journey passing for my mind in minutes, while a day passed for my sleeping form. As the train reached the central terminus of Zelanka City, I rose from my pod and prepared to depart. The advantage of these long journey trains being the quiet within. Few travellers on board, each alone and awaiting arrival, though the view had gone, the train speeding under the city in a dark and grey tunnel. At last, the train came to a stop at the Zelanka Central Terminus. I swiftly disembarked and broke into a run once more, sweeping up the long tunnels of the terminus to the sunlight and wind above. The air became salty and filled with flavours as I reached the surface. The West Walk Tunnel spilled out onto the promenade on the beach. The Aramatum Sea washing gently on the soft sands of Sri Lanka beach. Scattered people enjoying the warm morning sun and the gentle waves. I walked from the tunnel's mouth across the boards of the promenade where many stores and bars were filled with tourists and locals, out onto the warm and flower-fine sand of the beach. Sand quickly working itself between my toes. Shifting my clothing to a less modest level of coverage and sweeping my hair behind my shoulders, I gained speed toward the water, running into the cool sea and wading out until the water carried me. I began to swim, pushing away from the shore and soon diving down below the surface. The sea floor turning from sand to corals, scatterings of amateur divers swimming below me, snapping photos of fish for future recollections. As I pushed farther from the shore, the tourists were gradually replaced by locals, the richly red-coloured Martian kraken among them, though even they ignored me, most likely aware of my destination. I swam downward as well as out, eventually settling a few metres above the coral-filled floor of the sea. Ahead of me, the shimmering lights of my final destination could be seen. As I drew close to the light, the scattering of kraken had once again been joined by others, mostly those native to the water, though some were not. As I reached the structure, the coral had vanished behind me, my feet free to settle into the soft silt of the sea floor. I walked into the beckoning door beyond and waited for the pressurization cycle to complete. Entering the restaurant, I could see my date, already seated, smiling. She was as graceful as last I'd seen her. My mother and I, meeting at least once a decade. I was so glad to see her this time. I had much to tell her.